It was a cold December evening in a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. Snow blanketed the streets, creating a serene yet deceptive calm. The town's central square glimmered with festive lights, but the holiday spirit was tainted for many, especially for Marcus Hayes. Marcus, a black military veteran, had returned to his hometown after serving 2 tours in Afghanistan. Accompanying him was Duke, his loyal German shepherd and former military canine. The bond between man and dog was unshakable, forged through harrowing experiences in the battlefield. Marcus had hoped that coming home for Christmas would bring peace and a sense of belonging. But life in the small, predominantly white town was far from welcoming. Whispers followed him wherever he went, eyes filled with suspicion rather than gratitude for his service. Still, Marcus maintained his dignity, finding solace in Duke's steadfast presence. That evening, Marcus decided to take Duke for a walk along the snowy trails leading to the outskirts of town. The world seemed quieter there, the forest muffling the noise of judgment and prejudice. But as he turned a corner near an old gas station, his peaceful stroll was interrupted by the revving engines of motorcycles. A group of bikers, notorious for their racist behavior, had spotted Marcus. Their leader, a burly man with a Confederate flag patch on his leather jacket, sneered as the group encircled Marcus. "Well, look what we got here," the man growled. "A soldier boy who thinks he's better than us." Marcus calmly met their stares, his military training keeping his nerves steady. Duke stood at his side, his keen eyes scanning the threat. The dog's low growl was a warning, a sound that spoke of discipline and courage. The bikers, unaware of Duke's history, underestimated the bond between Marcus and his canine companion. They saw only an opportunity to intimidate, to reassert their twisted sense of power. What unfolded next would change their lives forever, as Marcus and Duke revealed the strength born of loyalty, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to justice. The leader of the bikers, who went by the name Jeb, leaned closer, his breath visible in the icy air. His taunting grin revealed yellowed teeth, and his cold eyes glinted with malice. The other bikers, 5 in total, surrounded Marcus and Duke, forming a tightening circle. "You don't belong here," Jeb spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Why don't you take your mutt and go back to where you came from?" Marcus stood tall, his years of military discipline evident in his unflinching gaze. "I belong wherever I choose to be," he replied, his voice steady. "And this is my hometown, same as yours." The reply seemed to ignite something in Jeb. He stepped forward, shoving Marcus backward slightly. Duke immediately reacted, stepping between his master and the aggressor. The German shepherd's ears flattened, and his growl deepened, a clear signal that he was ready to defend. One of the younger bikers chuckled nervously. "Careful, Jeb. That dog looks like it means business." Jeb scoffed and waved him off. "It's just a dog. All bark, no bite." But Marcus knew better. Duke wasn't just any dog. He was a highly trained military canine who had saved lives in combat zones. The bond between them wasn't just emotional. It was forged in life and death situations, each one relying on the other for survival. The bikers, emboldened by their numbers, began taunting Marcus further. "Bet you think you're a hero," one sneered. "Bet you think you're better than us." Marcus felt a flicker of anger, but forced himself to remain calm. He had faced far worse threats than these men, but the sting of racism was a wound that time never fully healed. He glanced at Duke, whose unwavering focus reminded him to stay composed. Jeb, however, wasn't done. He reached for the chain around Duke's neck. "Let's see how tough your mutt really is." The moment his hand moved, Duke acted. With lightning speed, the dog lunged forward, stopping just inches from Jeb's hand. His sharp teeth snapped shut in a warning, and his bark was deafening. Jeb stumbled back, his bravado faltering, his fear flickered in his eyes. "Call off your dog," Jeb shouted, his voice cracking. Marcus took a step forward, his presence commanding. "Duke doesn't attack unless I tell him to, but he will defend me if you push your luck." The tension hung thick in the air as the bikers hesitated. One of them muttered under his breath, "We should just go. This isn't worth it." But Jeb wasn't ready to back down. His pride was at stake, and he wasn't about to let Marcus walk away unscathed. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a switchblade. You think you're untouchable? Jeb snarled. Let's see how tough you really are. Before Jeb could take another step, Duke positioned himself protectively in front of Marcus, his body taut and ready. The sight of the knife triggered a memory for both Marcus and Duke, a memory of a mission gone wrong in Afghanistan, where Duke had saved Marcus from an enemy ambush. The dog's instincts were honed to perfection, and his training had prepared him for moments exactly like this. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Marcus warned, his voice sharp. Jeb hesitated, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. But before he could decide, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the night. Someone from a nearby house must have called the police, alerted by the commotion. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Let's go, Jeb, one of them urged. We don't need this kind of heat. Reluctantly, Jeb folded the blade and stepped back, his eyes burning with humiliation. This isn't over, he growled, pointing a finger at Marcus. You'll regret this. Marcus stood his ground, watching as the bikers mounted their motorcycles and sped away, the roar of their engines fading into the distance. As the police car pulled up, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The officer who stepped out was someone Marcus recognized, Officer Daniels, a younger cop who had once looked up to Marcus as a local hero before the latter joined the military. You okay, Marcus? Daniels asked, his voice tinged with concern. Marcus nodded. I'm fine. Duke had my back. Daniels knelt to pet Duke, who wagged his tail slightly, but kept his eyes on the direction the bikers had fled. Good dog, Daniels murmured. You know who they were? Yeah, Marcus replied. Jeb and his crew. Same guys who've been causing trouble around here for years. Daniels sighed, shaking his head. We've been trying to pin something on them, but they're slippery. This might be what we need. I'll file a report. As Daniels took Marcus's statement, Marcus couldn't help but think about how much had changed and how much hadn't since he'd left town. Prejudice still thrived, but so did the strength to confront it. For Marcus and Duke, this was just another battle in a life filled with challenges. But the fight wasn't over yet, and Marcus knew he had to prepare for whatever came next. The following morning, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the frosted windows. Duke lay by his feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the faint sounds of the outside world. The incident from the night before weighed heavily on Marcus's mind, not because of fear, but because of the familiar ache of frustration. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered such blatant hatred, but it was the first time since his return home. He had hoped his military service might afford him a measure of respect, but instead, it seemed to make him a bigger target. The town's chatter had already begun. Marcus could sense it when he stepped onto his front porch to grab the newspaper. Neighbors glanced his way, their looks a mixture of pity, curiosity, and disdain. The headline on the local paper only fueled the fire. Veteran confronts local biker, gang tensions escalate. With a sigh, Marcus folded the paper and headed back inside. He wasn't interested in becoming the center of a town-wide spectacle, but he also knew the bikers wouldn't let things rest. Later that day, Marcus decided to take Duke to the park. He needed space to think, and Duke, ever attentive, seemed to sense his master's unease. The park was quiet, the usual crowd sparse due to the cold. Marcus found a secluded bench near the edge of a frozen pond and sat down, letting Duke roam on his leash. As he watched Duke sniff the snow-covered ground, a voice broke his solitude. Mind if I join you? Marcus looked up to see an older man standing a few feet away, his breath puffing in the chilly air. He recognized him as Pastor Reuben, the minister of a small church on the outskirts of town. Marcus hesitated, but then nodded. Reuben sat down, folding his hands over his lap. Heard about what happened last night, he said gently. Marcus's jaw tightened. Word travels fast. In a town like this, it always does, Reuben replied. I'm sorry you had to go through that. It shouldn't have happened. Marcus nodded, but said nothing. Reuben studied him for a moment before continuing. You know, when I was a young man, I faced my fair share of hate. People thought the color of my skin made me less than them, but I found strength in something greater. Marcus glanced at him, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "And what was that?" "Faith," Reuben said simply. "Not just in God, but in myself. In the belief that no matter how dark things get, there's always a light to guide you through." Marcus looked away, his eyes falling on Duke, who had sat down in the snow, staring at his master as if waiting for a command. "I don't know if I have that kind of faith anymore," Marcus admitted quietly. Reuben placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Then maybe it's time to find it again. And not just for yourself, but for others. This town needs people like you, people who've seen the worst and still choose to fight for what's right." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Marcus turned to see a young woman walking toward them, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf. She had a determined look in her eyes. "Marcus Hayes?" she asked. "That's me," he replied cautiously. "I'm Claire Mitchell. I'm a journalist," she said, pulling out a notebook. "I'm writing a story on what happened last night. Do you have a moment to talk?" Marcus sighed, not sure if he wanted more attention, but Claire's earnest expression gave him pause. "What exactly do you want to know?" "I want to tell your side of the story," she said. "People need to understand what you're dealing with. The town's changing, whether folks like it or not, and voices like yours can make a difference." Marcus studied her, searching for any hint of ulterior motive. But she seemed genuine, and something about her determination reminded him of the people he'd fought alongside in the military. "All right," he said finally, "but only if you tell the whole story, not just about me, but about Duke, too." Claire smiled. "Deal." As they talked, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was a chance to shift the narrative, to show the town that prejudice could be confronted and overcome. Duke, sensing his master's lighter mood, wagged his tail and nudged Marcus's leg. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the park. Claire promised to keep Marcus updated on the article, and Reuben offered a final word of encouragement before heading back to his church. As Marcus and Duke walked home, the veteran felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Duke by his side and allies beginning to emerge, Marcus was ready to face whatever came next. The following day, Marcus awoke to a series of unexpected developments. The morning air was sharp and clear, and Duke was restless, pacing near the door. Marcus grabbed his coat and stepped outside, only to be greeted by a surprising sight. Claire Mitchell standing on his porch, holding a copy of the local newspaper. "Good morning," she said, her breath visible in the cold air. "Claire, what are you doing here?" Marcus asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "I thought you'd want to see this," she replied, handing him the paper. The headline splashed across the front page read, "Local Veteran Stands Tall Against Hate, a Community Divided." The article beneath, it wasn't just a recounting of the confrontation with the bikers. It was an expose on the racial tensions in the town, woven with Marcus's story and testimonials from others who had faced similar struggles. "You weren't kidding about telling the whole story," Marcus murmured as he scanned the article. Claire smiled faintly. "I don't think this town has seen something like this in a long time. But there's more. You've got support." Marcus looked up, puzzled. "Support?" "Check the last paragraph," Claire said, pointing to the paper. He followed her finger and read aloud. "Local activists have organized a community rally to stand against racism and support Marcus Hayes, a decorated veteran and hometown hero. The rally is scheduled for Saturday evening at Town Square." Marcus lowered the paper, his expression a mix of disbelief and apprehension. "I didn't ask for a rally." "No, but people want to stand with you," Claire said. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the town choosing what kind of place it wants to be." Before Marcus could respond, Duke let out a low growl. The dog stood by the fence, his sharp eyes fixed on a black truck idling down the street. Marcus followed Duke's gaze and immediately recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Jeb. The truck lingered for a moment before speeding off, leaving Marcus uneasy. "They're watching me," he said quietly. Claire frowned. "You think they'll retaliate?" "I don't think," Marcus replied. "I know." That afternoon, Marcus paid a visit to Pastor Reuben. The church, a modest brick building with a white steeple, was warm and inviting despite the chill outside. Reuben greeted Marcus with a firm handshake and ushered him into his office. "I saw the paper," Reuben said, gesturing for Marcus to sit. "It's powerful, but I imagine it's stirring the pot." Marcus nodded. "Jeb's crew isn't going to take this lying down. They're already watching me." Reuben leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Then we need to be ready. You're not alone in this, Marcus. People are waking up, and they want change. But it's going to take courage and strategy." The conversation turned to the upcoming rally. Reuben offered to help organize security and ensure the event remained peaceful. Marcus was reluctant to draw more attention to himself, but Reuben's steady conviction began to reassure him. "You've been through worse," Reuben said. "This is just another fight, and like all the others, you'll come out stronger." That evening, as Marcus walked home, a sense of unease lingered. The rally was only 2 days away, and tensions in the town were palpable. Duke stayed close, his keen instincts mirroring Marcus's unease. When they reached the house, Marcus noticed something strange. A small envelope had been taped to his front door. He tore it open and pulled out a piece of paper. The note, scrawled in jagged handwriting, was a threat. "Back off, or we'll finish what we started." Marcus clenched the note, his jaw tightening. His first instinct was to call the police, but he hesitated. Jeb's gang had connections in town, and Marcus wasn't sure how much he could trust the local authorities to take the threat seriously. Instead, he called Claire. "You got another story for me?" she asked when she picked up. "Not exactly," Marcus replied, his voice tense. "But I need you to see something." Claire arrived within minutes, and when Marcus showed her the note, her expression hardened. "This proves they're scared," she said. "They know people are rallying behind you, and they're desperate to intimidate you." Marcus nodded, though the weight of the situation was pressing down on him. "What do we do?" "We keep going," Claire said firmly. "We don't let them win." Late that night, Marcus sat in his living room, the note still in his hand. Duke lay at his feet, his calm presence a reminder of the strength they'd shared through countless battles. Marcus thought about the people who had already reached out to support him, Reuben, Claire, and the growing number of townsfolk willing to stand with him. But he also thought about the danger. The bikers weren't just bullies. They were a real threat. Marcus had faced many battles, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about survival. It was about standing for something bigger. As he gazed into the fire crackling in the hearth, Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't back down. Not this time. The next morning, Marcus awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The threat from Jeb and his gang had shaken him, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. Duke, ever attuned to his master's emotions, stayed close as Marcus prepared for the day. As Marcus brewed coffee, a knock at the door broke the quiet. He glanced cautiously through the peephole and was surprised to see Officer Daniels standing on his porch. "Morning, Marcus," Daniels said when Marcus opened the door. His tone was friendly but serious. "Mind if I come in?" "Sure," Marcus replied, stepping aside. Duke sniffed at the officer briefly before settling back by Marcus's side. Daniels took off his hat and held it in his hands. "I heard about the note," he began. "Claire Mitchell told me. She thought it was something I should know." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And?" Daniels sighed. "I've had my eye on Jeb and his crew for a while, but they're careful. This note gives us something tangible, though. If you're willing to press charges, we can start building a case against them." Marcus considered the offer. Would it even stick? "They've got connections in town. If this goes nowhere, it just puts me in more danger." "You're not wrong," Daniels admitted. "But things are changing. People are starting to see Jeb and his crew for what they are. You've got the community's attention now, Marcus. If you take a stand, others will follow." Marcus leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. He hated the idea of being a target, but he hated the thought of letting Jeb win even more. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it." Daniels nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Good. I'll file the report today, and I'll make sure we keep an eye on your place." That afternoon, Marcus drove to the church to meet Pastor Reuben. The small parking lot was filled with cars, and when Marcus stepped inside, he was surprised to find a group of townsfolk gathered in the sanctuary. Reuben greeted him at the door, a smile spreading across his face. "Word's gotten around about the rally," he said. People are ready to stand with you? Marcus scanned the room, recognizing faces both familiar and unfamiliar. There was Claire, speaking animatedly with a group of young activists. An elderly couple sat in the front pew, nodding along as a middle-aged man spoke about the importance of unity. "This is more than I expected," Marcus admitted. "You've inspired them," Reuben said. "Your story has shown them that it's time for change." Marcus felt a swell of emotion as he listened to the conversations around him. The people weren't just here to support him. They were here to take a stand against the hatred and division that had plagued the town for years. As the group discussed plans for the rally, Marcus noticed a young boy sitting alone near the back of the sanctuary. The boy, who couldn't have been older than 10, held a sketchpad in his hands and was drawing intently. Curious, Marcus approached him. "Hey there," he said, crouching to the boy's level. "What are you working on?" The boy looked up, his wide eyes filled with a mixture of shyness and curiosity. He held up the sketchpad, revealing a drawing of Marcus and Duke standing side by side. "That's impressive," Marcus said, genuinely moved. "What made you draw this?" "My mom said you're a hero," the boy replied quietly. "And I think Duke is too." Marcus smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. "What's your name?" "Eli," the boy said. "Well, Eli," Marcus said, "I think you're pretty brave for coming here today." Eli beamed, and Marcus ruffled the boy's hair before returning to the front of the sanctuary. As the day wore on, the rally plans began to take shape. Reuben and Claire worked tirelessly to coordinate logistics, while Marcus spoke with several attendees about their own experiences with prejudice in the town. By evening, Marcus felt a growing sense of hope. The rally wasn't just about him anymore. It was a chance for the town to confront its past and choose a different future. Later that night, Marcus sat on his porch with Duke, the two of them watching the stars. The note from Jeb still lingered in his mind, but so did the faces of the people who had stood with him that day. "You've always been good at keeping me safe, haven't you, boy?" Marcus said, scratching Duke behind the ears. The dog wagged his tail in response, his eyes shining with loyalty. As Marcus gazed into the night, he made a silent vow. He would face whatever came next, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in the possibility of change. The days leading up to the rally passed in a blur of activity. Marcus found himself swept up in a whirlwind of planning and coordination. The community's support was heartening, but it also came with complications. Old tensions began surfacing, not just between the townsfolk and the bikers, but within the town itself. At the local diner, Marcus overheard two older men arguing at the counter. One of them, Mr. Grady, was a long-time resident who had always been polite but distant toward Marcus. "I'm just saying," Grady grumbled, stirring his coffee. "Stirring things up like this might do more harm than good. People around here don't like change." The other man, a younger teacher named Carlos, shook his head. "Change is exactly what we need. It's people like you clinging to the past that let this kind of hatred grow." Grady scowled. "I don't support those bikers, but making a spectacle out of it, that's not how you fix things." Marcus didn't interrupt, but their conversations stayed with him. It was clear that not everyone was on board with the rally, even among those who claimed to oppose Jeb and his gang. Meanwhile, Claire's article had gained traction, drawing attention from outside the town. A regional news station picked up the story, sending a reporter to cover the rally. Marcus was initially wary of the added publicity, but Claire convinced him it was a chance to amplify the message. "People need to see what's happening here," she said as they walked through the square, where volunteers were setting up for the event. "This isn't just about this town. It's about showing that hate doesn't win." Her optimism was contagious, but Marcus couldn't ignore the increased risks. The added attention meant Jeb and his crew would feel even more threatened and more desperate. Sure enough, the bikers began escalating their intimidation tactics. One afternoon, as Marcus returned home from the store, he found his front door spray-painted with a slur. Duke growled as Marcus inspected the damage, his anger simmering beneath the surface. The vandalism was reported to Officer Daniels, who promised to increase patrols near Marcus's home. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that things were coming to a head. As the rally approached, another unexpected challenge emerged. A young woman named Rachel approached Marcus during a community meeting. She was quiet at first, standing at the back of the room as others spoke, but eventually she raised her hand. I need to say something, she began, her voice trembling. I've been involved with Jeb's group. The room fell silent, all eyes on Rachel. Marcus studied her, noting the way she wrung her hands nervously. I didn't know how bad it was at first, Rachel continued. I thought it was just a club. But then I started seeing the things they did, the things they said, and I couldn't be part of it anymore. Why are you telling us this now? Someone asked skeptically. Rachel swallowed hard. Because they're planning something for the rally. Jeb is furious about all the attention, and he wants to send a message. I thought you should know. Her words sent a ripple of unease through the room. Reuben stood and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Thank you for coming forward, he said. It takes courage to admit something like that. Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with guilt. I want to help. I don't know if I can undo what I've done, but I want to make it right. Rachel's warning changed the tone of the preparations. Security became a top priority, with Daniels and his team working closely with Reuben and the volunteers. Marcus appreciated their efforts, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the rally might become a battleground. As he and Duke patrolled the square that evening, checking the arrangements, Marcus spoke softly to his dog. What do you think, buddy? Are we ready for this? Duke looked up at him, his steady gaze offering silent reassurance. The night before the rally, Marcus found himself at the church once more, seeking solace in the quiet sanctuary. Reuben joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. You've been carrying a heavy burden, Reuben said, handing Marcus a mug. How are you holding up? I don't know, Marcus admitted. I want to believe we're doing the right thing, but what if it makes things worse? Reuben sipped his tea thoughtfully. Change always comes with challenges, but it's better to stand and fight for what's right than to live in fear and regret. Marcus nodded, the pastor's words resonating with him. I just hope the town's ready for this. They'll follow your lead, Reuben said with a smile. You've already shown them what courage looks like. As Marcus walked home that night, he felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. The rally was no longer just a community event. It was a turning point, a test of whether the town could rise above its divisions or be consumed by them. He looked down at Duke, whose alert posture reminded him of the countless missions they'd faced together. No matter what happens tomorrow, Marcus said, we'll face it together. The day of the rally dawned cold and overcast, a kind of weather that seeped into your bones and made even the most confident plans feel fragile. Marcus stood at the window, watching the town square come alive with activity. Volunteers were setting up banners, arranging chairs, and testing microphones for the speakers. The rally's theme, United Against Hate, was emblazoned on a large banner strung across the stage. Duke sat by the door, his ears perked up as if he too could sense the importance of the day. Marcus took a deep breath and clipped the leash onto Duke's collar. You ready, boy? He asked. Duke wagged his tail in response. When Marcus arrived at the square, he was met with an unexpected sight, a larger crowd than anyone had anticipated. People from neighboring towns had joined, drawn by the buzz surrounding the event and the promise of standing for something greater. Marcus spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Reuben was speaking with a group of local business owners who had donated supplies for the rally. Claire was on the sidelines with a camera crew, capturing the growing energy of the gathering. Rachel stood near the stage, her posture tense as she scanned the crowd. She hadn't spoken much since her confession about Jeb's plans, but her presence was a small act of defiance. Marcus made his way toward the stage, shaking hands and exchanging nods of encouragement with the people who stopped him. He felt their hope and their expectations pressing down on him, a weight that was both inspiring and daunting. As the rally began, Reuben stepped onto the stage to address the crowd. His voice, steady and strong, carried across the square. We gather here today, not just to stand against hate, but to stand for love, unity, and justice, he began. Our town has a choice to make. We can let fear and division rule us, or we can choose a better path. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy palpable. Marcus watched from the sidelines, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and apprehension. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, the applause was deafening. He stepped onto the stage, Duke by his side, and took a moment to look out at the sea of faces. "I never thought I'd find myself here," he began, his voice calm but firm. "When I came back to this town, I hoped to find peace. Instead, I found that the battles I fought overseas were nothing compared to the battles we face right here at home." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But I've learned something through all of this. We're stronger together. Hate thrives on fear and silence. But when we stand up, when we speak out, we take its power away." The crowd cheered, and Marcus felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. "And I'm not standing here alone," he continued, gesturing to Duke. "This is Duke, my partner and my protector. He's saved my life more times than I can count. And just like Duke and I had to rely on each other in the darkest moments, we have to rely on each other now." The applause grew louder, and Marcus stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding. As the speeches continued, Marcus felt a growing sense of unease. His eyes scanned the edges of the crowd, searching for anything out of place. Duke seemed to sense it too, his body tense and alert. Rachel approached Marcus quietly, her face pale. "They're here," she whispered. Marcus's stomach dropped. "Where?" Rachel nodded toward a side street. "They're watching from the edge of the square. Jeb and a few others." Marcus followed her gaze and spotted them. Jeb and 3 of his gang leaning against their motorcycles. They weren't making a scene, but their presence was a clear attempt at intimidation. "What do we do?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Marcus looked at her, his own fear tempered by a resolve forged in far more dangerous situations. "We don't let them scare us," he said. "Stay with Claire and the others. I'll keep an eye on them." The tension in the air was palpable as the rally continued. Jeb's gang didn't make any moves, but their presence cast a shadow over the event. Marcus stayed close to the stage, his every sense heightened. As the rally began to wind down, Reuben led the crowd in a moment of silence for all those who had suffered from hatred and violence. The stillness was powerful, a stark contrast to the tension at the edges of the square. But just as the silence ended, a commotion broke out near the side street. Marcus turned to see one of Jeb's men arguing with a group of young activists. The argument escalated quickly, and before Marcus could intervene, a punch was thrown. Duke barked loudly, his sharp warning cutting through the noise. Marcus rushed toward the fight, his military instincts kicking in. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice commanding. The crowd turned, the chaos drawing everyone's attention. Marcus placed himself between the 2 groups, his hands raised. "This isn't who we are," he said, addressing both sides. "We came here to stand against hate, not to let it divide us further." The tension lingered for a moment before the groups began to back down. Jeb, who had been watching the scene with a smug expression, shouted, "You're all wasting your time. Nothing's gonna change." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "Change is already happening." As the rally wound down, the mood was a mixture of triumph and unease. Many in the crowd were energized, feeling that they had taken the first step toward a more united community. But Marcus couldn't shake the tension that lingered in the air. Jeb and his gang had retreated after the brief altercation, but their parting words echoed in Marcus's mind. Nothing's going to change. It wasn't just a taunt, it felt like a warning. Duke, ever watchful, stayed close to Marcus's side as they helped pack up chairs and equipment. The dog's keen eyes darted around the square, his body language telling Marcus that he, too, sensed something was amiss. As night fell, Marcus returned home, exhausted but unable to rest. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, replaying the day's events in his mind. Duke lay by his feet, his head resting on his paws. Just as Marcus began to relax, Duke's ears perked up. The dog stood and let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the front door. Marcus tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the baseball bat he kept by the table. A loud knock broke the silence, followed by a voice. "It's me, Daniels." Marcus exhaled and opened the door to find Officer Daniels standing on the porch, his expression grim. "Sorry to bother you this late," Daniels said, stepping inside. "But I thought you should know. We found something." Marcus motioned for Daniels to continue as he poured him a cup of tea. "We stopped one of Jeb's guys on his way out of town," Daniels explained. "Routine traffic stop. But when we searched his truck, we found something troubling, a map of the rally site with notes and markings." Marcus's jaw tightened. "What kind of notes?" Daniels hesitated. "Instructions for disruption, places to set fires, ways to scatter the crowd, and other things. It looks like they had plans to turn today into something much worse." The weight of Daniels's words settled heavily on Marcus. Why didn't they go through with it? He asked. "Your guess is as good as mine," Daniels replied. "Maybe the crowd was bigger than they expected. Maybe Rachel's warning scared them off. Either way, this isn't over." Marcus couldn't sleep that night. The revelation about the gang's plans gnawed at him. It wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was about causing real harm. As he sat in the living room, staring at the map Daniels had shown him, Marcus's mind began to piece things together. Jeb and his crew weren't acting out of impulse. This was calculated. And if they were willing to go to such lengths, what else were they planning? Duke, sensing his master's unease, rested his head on Marcus's lap. Marcus stroked the dog's fur absently, his thoughts racing. "We'll figure this out, Duke," he said softly. "We've faced worse." The next morning, Marcus met with Claire and Pastor Reuben to discuss the discovery. Claire's face darkened as she studied the map. "This changes everything," she said. "We need to let people know. If the community sees how far Jeb is willing to go, they'll realize this isn't just about you, it's about all of us." Reuben nodded in agreement. "The more people understand the threat, the more united they'll become. But we have to be careful. If we spread this too widely, it could cause panic." Marcus sighed. "We need to be strategic. We can't let fear dictate our actions, but we can't ignore the danger either." The three of them spent hours strategizing, deciding how best to share the information without inciting chaos. They agreed to hold a follow-up meeting with key community leaders, ensuring the town remained vigilant without succumbing to fear. Meanwhile, Rachel continued to be a wild card. Her decision to leave Jeb's gang and warn Marcus had been brave, but her presence still drew suspicion from some members of the community. At the follow-up meeting, an older woman named Mrs. Harper voiced what many were thinking. "How do we know we can trust her?" she asked, her tone sharp. She was part of their group. For all we know, this could be a trap. Rachel's face flushed with shame, but she stood her ground. "I understand why you feel that way," she said. "But I'm here because I want to make things right. I've seen what Jeb is capable of, and I couldn't stay silent anymore." Marcus stepped in, his voice firm. "Rachel risked everything to warn us. Without her, we might not have known about their plans. She's not the enemy Jeb is." Mrs. Harper relented, though her expression remained skeptical. As the meeting ended, Marcus pulled Rachel aside. "You're doing the right thing," he told her. "But it's not going to be easy." "I know," Rachel replied. "But if I don't stand up to them now, I'll never forgive myself." Her resolve reminded Marcus of the many people he'd served with in the military, ordinary individuals who rose to extraordinary challenges when it mattered most. That evening, Marcus and Duke patrolled the edges of the town, keeping a watchful eye for anything suspicious. As they walked, Marcus noticed subtle signs of change. Lights in windows where people had once ignored him, neighbors who nodded in greeting instead of turning away. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The fallout from the discovery of Jeb's plans rippled through the town like an undercurrent of unease. Though the rally had been a success in many ways, the knowledge that it could have ended in chaos left everyone on edge. Marcus, more determined than ever to protect his community, began working closely with Officer Daniels, Pastor Reuben, and Claire to devise a strategy for the weeks ahead. The first order of business was organizing a town hall meeting. Marcus wanted to bring people together to discuss the threat openly and encourage them to stand united. Claire suggested using her connections to invite a civil rights advocate, someone with experience in diffusing racial tensions and fostering dialogue. "I know a professor from the university," Claire said during one of their planning sessions. "Dr. Harriet Cole. She's worked with communities like ours before. If anyone can help us navigate this, it's her. Marcus agreed, and within a few days, Dr. Cole arrived in town. A tall, commanding woman with a quiet strength, she immediately set to work meeting with local leaders and listening to their concerns. "You're facing a battle on two fronts," Dr. Cole told Marcus during their first meeting. "One is against the overt threat of Jeb and his gang. The other is against the quieter, more insidious prejudice that lingers in this town. Both require patience, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths." Marcus nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I've faced a lot of battles in my life," he said. "This one feels different, though. It's not just about survival, it's about changing minds." Dr. Cole smiled. "Exactly. And that's where we start." The town hall was scheduled for the following Saturday. In the days leading up to the event, Marcus made a point to visit as many residents as he could, listening to their concerns and encouraging them to attend. One evening, he knocked on the door of Mrs. Harper, the woman who had voiced skepticism about Rachel at the follow-up meeting. She greeted him cautiously, her expression wary. "Mrs. Harper," Marcus began, "I wanted to talk to you about Rachel." The older woman folded her arms. "I still don't trust her, Marcus. People don't just change overnight." "I understand," Marcus said patiently, "but I've seen change happen in the most unlikely places. When I was overseas, I worked with people who were supposed to be my enemies. We found common ground because we had to. Rachel isn't perfect, but she's trying to make amends. That counts for something." Mrs. Harper sighed, her demeanor softening slightly. "Maybe you're right, but it's hard to let go of doubt when you've been hurt before." "It is," Marcus agreed, "but holding on to that doubt won't help us move forward. We have to trust each other, even when it's hard." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Mrs. Harper nodded. "I'll think about it." Rachel, meanwhile, was struggling with her own doubts. Despite Marcus's support, she felt the weight of her past actions pressing down on her. One evening, she visited the church, seeking solace in the quiet sanctuary. Reuben found her sitting in a pew, her head bowed. "Looking for answers?" he asked gently. Rachel nodded without looking up. "I keep thinking about the things I did, the things I let happen. How do I make up for that?" Reuben sat beside her, his presence calm and steady. "You can't change the past, Rachel, but you can change what you do moving forward. Redemption isn't about erasing your mistakes. It's about learning from them and using what you've learned to make a difference." Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if it's not enough? It's a start," Reuben said. "And sometimes that's all we can ask for." As the town hall approached, Marcus and Duke took on a more visible role in the community. They visited schools, talked with business owners, and even joined a local charity drive to collect winter coats for families in need. One afternoon, Marcus and Duke stopped by the diner where Marcus had overheard the argument between Mr. Grady and Carlos. To his surprise, the two men were sitting together, engaged in what appeared to be a friendly debate. "Mind if I join you?" Marcus asked, sliding into the booth. Grady looked up, his expression guarded. "Marcus, didn't expect to see you here." "I've been making the rounds," Marcus said, "trying to get folks to come to the town hall." Grady sipped his coffee, his gaze thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said at the rally," he admitted, "about standing together. Maybe it's time I stopped worrying so much about rocking the boat." Carlos grinned. "Told you he'd come around eventually." Marcus chuckled, feeling a small spark of hope. "The more voices we have, the stronger we'll be." That evening, Marcus returned home to find another note taped to his door. This one was different from Jeb's earlier threats. It was hastily scrawled, but held a sense of urgency. "You need to be careful. Things are happening faster than you realize." There was no signature, but Marcus had a sinking feeling about its source. He turned to Duke, who growled softly, as if sensing the unease in his master. "What are they planning, boy?" Marcus murmured. "And who's trying to warn us?" The tension in the town was palpable as Saturday approached. The town hall meeting, initially intended to bring the community together, now carried an air of unease. The mysterious warning note had left Marcus on edge. Though it didn't name names, it was clear that someone perhaps from inside Jeb's group was aware of a brewing storm and wanted to tip him off. Marcus shared the note with Officer Daniels and Claire. Daniels took it seriously, promising to increase patrols near the meeting site. Claire, ever the investigator, saw the note as another puzzle piece. "Whoever wrote this is taking a big risk," she said, studying the handwriting. "They're trying to help, but they're scared." "Scared of what?" Marcus asked. "Scared of Jeb," Claire replied grimly. "Or worse, scared of what's coming." The town hall meeting was held in the high school gymnasium. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a long table was set up at the front for the speakers. Marcus, Pastor Reuben, Dr. Harriet Cole, and Officer Daniels. The gym quickly filled with townsfolk, their faces a mix of curiosity, hope, and apprehension. Rachel arrived early, sitting near the front with a small group of young activists. Though her posture was tense, she seemed determined to see the meeting through. Marcus gave her a reassuring nod as he passed, and she managed a small, grateful smile. Dr. Cole opened the meeting with a powerful speech about the dangers of division and the importance of collective action. "Change begins when we decide that hatred and fear have no place in our hearts or our community," she said. "But change also requires courage, the courage to confront what is wrong and work toward what is right." Her words were met with applause, though the room remained heavy with anticipation. Next, Pastor Reuben spoke about the role of faith and unity in overcoming adversity. Then it was Marcus's turn. Standing at the podium, Marcus felt the weight of the room's expectations pressing down on him. He took a deep breath and began. "This town has been my home for most of my life," he said. "And like many of you, I've seen its good and its bad. I've seen kindness and community, but I've also seen the scars left by hatred." He paused, scanning the room. "We can't pretend those scars don't exist, but we can choose to heal them. We can choose to be better for ourselves, for our children, and for the future of this town." The audience erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a flicker of hope. But even as he stepped back from the podium, his military instincts warned him that something wasn't right. As the meeting continued, Marcus noticed Rachel shifting uneasily in her seat. He followed her gaze to the back of the gym, where two men lingered near the exit. Their leather jackets and tense postures gave them away as members of Jeb's crew. Marcus leaned over to Officer Daniels, who was seated beside him. "We've got company," he murmured. Daniels nodded subtly, signaling one of his deputies to keep an eye on the men. The tension in the gym escalated as the meeting reached its open discussion portion. Residents began sharing their concerns, and while many spoke in support of unity, others voiced skepticism and fear. "This all sounds good in theory," Mr. Grady said, standing to address the room. "But what happens when people like Jeb don't back down? What happens when words aren't enough?" Before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted near the back. One of the men in leather jackets was arguing with a deputy, his voice rising. "We're just here to listen," he shouted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The argument drew the crowd's attention, and the room fell silent as Marcus stood and approached the scene. "What's the problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The man smirked, his posture defiant. "No problem, soldier. We're just exercising our right to be here." "You're welcome to listen," Marcus said evenly. "But if you're here to cause trouble, you'll need to leave." The man took a step closer, his smirk turning into a sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" Before Marcus could respond, Duke stepped forward, placing himself between Marcus and the man. The dog's low growl was a clear warning, and the man hesitated, his bravado faltering. The tension broke when Daniels intervened, escorting the two men out of the gym. But their departure left an ominous feeling in the air. As the meeting concluded, Marcus and the others lingered to discuss what had happened. "This isn't over," Daniels said. "They're testing us, trying to see how far they can push before we react." Claire, who had been recording the meeting, frowned. "We need to stay vigilant. If they're this bold in public, who knows what they're planning in private?" Marcus nodded, his jaw set. "We need to be ready for anything." Later that night, as Marcus and Duke returned home, they found another note waiting for them. This one was taped to the front gate and written in the same hurried handwriting as before. "It's happening tomorrow. Be ready." Marcus stared at the note, his heart pounding. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing for certain: Jeb and his crew were about to make their move. The warning note weighed heavily on Marcus as he prepared for the following day. He sat at the kitchen table with Officer Daniels, Pastor Reuben, Claire, and Rachel, all gathered to devise a plan. Duke lay nearby, alert as ever, his gaze flicking between the tense faces in the room. "They're planning something big," Marcus said, placing the note on the table. "We need to be ready, but we can't let panic take over. Whatever happens, we have to keep the community safe." Daniels nodded. "I've got deputies stationed near key locations: your house, the church, and the square. If anything happens, we'll respond quickly." Rachel, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke. "I think I know what they're planning," she said hesitantly. All eyes turned to her. "They've talked about this before, causing chaos during a public event. It's not just intimidation. They want to send a message. They'll wait until the crowd is big enough to make an impact, then strike." Marcus frowned. "Do you know where they might be hiding or what they're using?" Rachel shook her head, her hands trembling. "No, but I heard Jeb mention the old warehouse near the train tracks. It's been abandoned for years, and they use it for meetings sometimes." Daniels stood immediately. "We need to check it out. If they're storing weapons or planning anything dangerous, we need to stop it before it starts." "I'm coming with you," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Daniels hesitated, but eventually relented. "Fine, but stay behind me. This is a police operation." That evening, Marcus, Daniels, and 2 deputies approached the warehouse under the cover of darkness. The building loomed against the night sky, its broken windows and rusted walls casting eerie shadows. Duke padded silently beside Marcus, his ears perked and his body tense. The group split into pairs, Daniels and Marcus taking the front entrance, while the deputies circled around to cover the rear. The air was thick with anticipation as they moved cautiously through the decaying structure. Inside, the warehouse smelled of mildew and oil. Broken machinery and empty crates littered the space, creating a maze of obstacles. Duke's low growl alerted Marcus to movement ahead. Daniels signaled for silence, and they crept forward. The faint murmur of voices reached their ears, and Marcus spotted a group of men huddled near a stack of crates. Among them was Jeb, his burly figure unmistakable. "We strike tomorrow, no matter what," Jeb was saying. "Let them think they've won. We'll show them who really runs this town." Daniels gestured for the group to retreat, but as they began to move, a loose piece of debris clattered underfoot. The sound echoed through the warehouse, and Jeb's head snapped up. "Who's there?" he barked. The men grabbed makeshift weapons, pipes and bats, and began advancing toward the noise. Daniels quickly radioed the deputies outside. "We're made. Move in now." The confrontation erupted in seconds. Jeb's men charged toward Marcus and Daniels, their shouts filling the warehouse. Duke sprang into action, placing himself between Marcus and the advancing attackers. "Stand down," Daniels shouted, drawing his weapon. "This is the police." But Jeb and his crew didn't relent. One of them swung a pipe toward Marcus, but Duke intercepted, snapping at the man's arm and forcing him to drop the weapon. Marcus used the moment to disarm another attacker, his military training taking over. The deputies burst through the rear entrance, shouting commands and subduing the rest of the group. Jeb, however, wasn't ready to surrender. He lunged at Marcus, a knife gleaming in his hand. Marcus sidestepped the attack, using Jeb's momentum to knock him off balance. Before Jeb could recover, Duke leapt forward, pinning him to the ground with a ferocious snarl. Daniels cuffed Jeb while Duke held him in place, his sharp teeth bared in a clear warning. "It's over, Jeb," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "You've lost." Jeb glared at him, his bravado crumbling. "This town will never change," he spat. "That's where you're wrong," Marcus replied. "It already is." With Jeb and his crew in custody, the immediate threat was neutralized. The deputies found crude weapons and incendiary devices among the crates, confirming Rachel's fears. The swift action likely saved countless lives, but Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. The next morning, news of the warehouse raid spread quickly through the town. Marcus, Claire, and Reuben stood in the square, addressing a small crowd that had gathered to hear what had happened. "Yesterday, we faced a real threat," Marcus said. "But because we stood together, we stopped it. This is what happens when we refuse to let fear divide us." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers carrying a renewed sense of hope. Rachel stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "I was part of the problem, but I want to be part of the solution now. I hope you'll give me that chance." Her words were met with tentative applause, a sign that trust could be rebuilt one step at a time. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus stood with Duke, watching as the townsfolk began to repair the cracks that had long divided them. "You've earned a good rest, buddy," Marcus said, scratching Duke behind the ears. The dog wagged his tail, his steadfast loyalty, a reminder of the strength found in unity and resilience. The morning after the warehouse raid, Marcus felt a cautious sense of relief. With Jeb and several of his crew in custody, the immediate threat had been neutralized. However, the shadow of Jeb's words lingered. "This town will never change." Marcus knew the battle for the town's future wasn't over. Jeb's arrest had emboldened some residents to speak out, but it had also stirred up resentment among those who clung to the old ways. The divide in the town was more visible than ever, and tensions simmered just below the surface. Later that day, Marcus joined Claire and Dr. Cole at the church, where Pastor Reuben was hosting a community forum to discuss the next steps. The room was packed, and the energy was a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Dr. Cole began the meeting with a powerful statement. "What happened yesterday was a victory, but it was only one battle. True change requires persistence and unity. It requires us to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our community." Her words resonated with many, but the atmosphere shifted when Mr. Grady stood up to speak. "I understand what you're saying, but not everyone here agrees," Grady said. "Some folks think all this attention is just stirring up trouble. They're scared of what might happen next." Reuben stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "Fear is natural, but it can't be our guide. If we let fear dictate our actions, we'll never move forward." The debate continued, with voices rising and falling as residents shared their perspectives. Marcus listened intently, noting how deeply ingrained the town's divisions were. It wasn't just about Jeb and his gang. It was about years of mistrust and unspoken prejudice. As the meeting wore on, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Daniels. "Urgent. Need to meet. Come to the station." Marcus excused himself and headed to the police station, where Daniels was waiting in his office. "What's going on?" Marcus asked. Daniels looked grim. "We've got a problem. A few of Jeb's guys who weren't at the warehouse have gone underground. We've been hearing chatter that they're planning something big to retaliate." Marcus's stomach sank. "Do we know where they are?" "Not yet," Daniels admitted, "but they're angry and desperate. That makes them dangerous." Marcus nodded, his military instincts kicking in. "What's the plan?" "We're increasing patrols and keeping an ear to the ground," Daniels said. "But I need you to stay vigilant. You're still their biggest target." That evening, as Marcus walked home with Duke, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He couldn't help but think about the people who were counting on him, the community that was slowly beginning to heal. "You ready for another fight, boy?" Marcus asked, glancing down at Duke. The dog's steady gaze and wagging tail were all the reassurance he needed. The town square was quiet the next morning, the stillness almost unsettling. Marcus had just finished his coffee when the phone rang. It was Claire. "You need to get to the square," she said, her voice urgent. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, already grabbing his jacket. "There's been a threat. A group claiming to support Jeb left a message online. They're planning something today." Marcus was out the door before she could finish, Duke trotting at his side. When Marcus arrived at the square, he found Daniels and several deputies already there, setting up a perimeter. Reuben and Claire were speaking with volunteers who had gathered to help. "What do we know?" Marcus asked Daniels. "Not much," Daniels admitted. The message was vague, but it mentioned targeting the square. "We're treating it as credible." As the morning wore on, more residents began arriving, determined to stand together despite the threat. Marcus felt a swell of pride at their courage, but also a deep sense of responsibility. By midday, The square was bustling with activity. Children played near the fountain, and vendors handed out food and drinks. The tension from earlier seemed to ease, but Marcus remained on high alert, scanning the crowd for anything suspicious. Then Duke's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. Marcus followed the dog's gaze and spotted a man slipping through the crowd, his movements furtive. "Daniels," Marcus called, nodding toward the man. "We've got something." Daniels and a deputy moved quickly, intercepting the man before he could leave the square. As they searched him, they found a small device, a crude incendiary bomb. The discovery sent shockwaves through the crowd, but Marcus and the others acted quickly to maintain order. "This is what they wanted," Marcus said, addressing the crowd through a microphone. "They wanted us to be afraid, to turn against each other. But we're stronger than their hate. We won't let them win." The crowd erupted in applause, their unity unshaken. The day ended without further incidents, and the man was taken into custody. Though the threat had been neutralized, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. The community had taken an important step, but the journey ahead would be long and challenging. That evening, as Marcus sat on his porch with Duke, he reflected on everything they had faced. The town was changing, slowly but surely, and he was determined to see it through. "You did good today, boy," Marcus said, scratching Duke behind the ears. The dog wagged his tail, his loyalty unwavering. Marcus gazed at the stars, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead might be uncertain, but one thing was clear: they wouldn't walk it alone. The tension in the town had reached its peak. With the failed bounding attempt in the square, and Jeb's gang still lurking in the shadows, the atmosphere was charged with both defiance and apprehension. The community, however, refused to cower. Inspired by Marcus's courage and the swift action of Daniels and his team, more residents began speaking out, rallying around the message of unity. But the lingering threat couldn't be ignored. Jeb's remaining crew had gone quiet, and Marcus knew from experience that silence often preceded a storm. 2 nights after the incident in the square, Marcus awoke to Duke's sharp bark. The dog stood by the door, his posture rigid, his ears flat against his head. Marcus immediately grabbed the baseball bat he kept beside his bed and moved cautiously to the window. Outside, shadows flickered near the edge of his property. Marcus could make out several figures moving under the cover of darkness. He grabbed his phone and called Daniels. "They're here," Marcus said, keeping his voice low. "Stay inside," Daniels instructed. "We're on our way." But Marcus knew better than to wait passively. Whoever was out there had come with a purpose, and he wasn't about to let them take him by surprise. He motioned for Duke to stay close as he stepped onto the porch, his presence illuminated by the single bulb above the door. "Who's there?" Marcus called, his voice steady. For a moment, there was no response. Then, a figure stepped into the light one of Jeb's lieutenants. "A wiry man named Dale. We just want to talk," Dale said, his tone laced with mockery. Marcus tightened his grip on the bat. "You've got no business here. Turn around and leave." Dale smirked, and more figures emerged from the shadows, each holding makeshift weapons, pipes, bats, and chains. "You made a lot of noise in this town," Dale said. "We're here to quiet it down." Before Marcus could respond, Duke lunged forward, his sharp bark cutting through the night. The gang hesitated, their confidence wavering in the face of the formidable dog. Marcus stood his ground, his military training kicking in. "This is your last chance," he said. "Walk away, or you'll regret it." But Dale wasn't backing down. "Get him," he ordered. The gang advanced, but before they could reach the porch, flashing blue and red lights filled the night. Daniels and his team arrived just in time, their vehicles screeching to a halt as officers poured out, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground," Daniels shouted, his voice echoing through the night. Caught off guard, most of the gang complied, but Dale made a run for it. Marcus didn't hesitate. He whistled sharply, and Duke took off after the fleeing man. The dog moved with precision, tackling Dale before he could disappear into the woods. Marcus caught up moments later, securing Dale until Daniels arrived to make the arrest. With the gang subdued and taken into custody, the immediate danger had passed. Marcus stood in the cold night air, his heart pounding as he watched the officers secure the scene. "You okay?" Daniels asked, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "Thanks for showing up when you did." Daniels smiled. "You made it easy for us to find them." The next day, the town was buzzing with news of the confrontation. The arrests had effectively dismantled Jeb's crew, and the community breathed a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in months, it felt like the town could finally begin to heal. Pastor Reuben held a service that evening, inviting everyone to come together in gratitude and reflection. The church was packed, with standing room only, as residents filled the pews. Marcus, seated near the front with Duke at his feet, listened as Reuben spoke about the power of resilience and unity. "We faced a great challenge," Reuben said, his voice strong, "but we overcame it by standing together. Let this be a lesson to us all. Hate can only thrive in silence and division. When we speak out and support one another, we can achieve incredible things." As the service ended, Rachel approached Marcus, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me," she said. "I don't know if I deserve it, but I'll keep trying to make things right." Marcus smiled. "You've already taken the hardest step. Keep moving forward." That night, Marcus sat on his porch with Duke, watching the stars. The town was quiet, but this time it was a peaceful quiet, a sign that things were beginning to change. "You've been through a lot, buddy," Marcus said, scratching Duke behind the ears. The dog wagged his tail, his eyes reflecting the loyalty and courage that had carried them through countless challenges. Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. The fight wasn't over, not completely, but for the first time, he believed that the town was on the right path. "We've got a long road ahead," Marcus said, his voice soft, "but we're not walking it alone." Duke rested his head on Marcus's lap, the bond between them unbroken and stronger than ever. The weeks following the arrests brought a tangible shift to the town. While the scars of division and prejudice couldn't be erased overnight, the community began taking meaningful steps toward healing. People who had once avoided difficult conversations were now engaging in them, guided by the courage and leadership they had seen in Marcus and others who stood against hatred. Rachel became a visible presence at community events, working tirelessly to repair the damage she had been a part of. Her humility and dedication gradually won over skeptics, including Mrs. Harper, who approached her one day with a tentative smile. "I judged you harshly," Mrs. Harper admitted, "but I see now that you're trying to do right, and that matters." Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Claire's article about the rally and the events surrounding Jeb's gang went viral, drawing attention far beyond the town's borders. Messages of support poured in from across the country, with many praising Marcus for his bravery and resilience. "You've become a symbol of hope," Claire told him during one of their conversations. "People see what you've done here and believe it's possible in their own towns." Marcus shook his head, a modest smile playing on his lips. "I'm just doing what I can, like anyone else. It's the people here who've made the real change." The church became a hub for community efforts, with Pastor Reuben leading initiatives to foster dialogue and support marginalized groups. Dr. Harriet Cole continued to visit, offering guidance and helping the town create programs to address systemic issues. One evening, during a town meeting, Reuben stood before the gathered residents and posed a question that resonated deeply. "What kind of town do we want to leave for our children?" His words sparked a series of discussions that led to tangible actions, including a renewed commitment to equality, education, and justice. For Marcus, life began to settle into a new rhythm. He continued to work closely with the community while carving out time for himself and Duke. A bond between man and dog had only deepened through their trials, and Duke remained Marcus's constant companion and protector. One afternoon, Marcus visited the local school to speak with a group of students about his experiences. Eli, the young boy who had drawn a picture of Marcus and Duke, was among them. "What's the most important thing you learned as a soldier?" One student asked. Marcus thought for a moment before answering. "That we're stronger together than we are alone," he said. "It's the people around you, your family, your friends, your community, that make the difference. And sometimes, the smallest act of courage can inspire something much bigger. Eli raised his hand. Like Duke being brave? Marcus smiled. Exactly like Duke, he reminds me every day what loyalty and courage look like. As winter gave way to spring, the town continued to evolve. The memories of Jeb's gang and their hateful actions remained, but they served as a stark reminder of what the town refused to tolerate. Marcus often walked with Duke through the town square, nodding to neighbors and exchanging greetings. The square, once a place of tension and uncertainty, had become a symbol of resilience, a place where people gathered not out of fear, but out of hope. One evening, Marcus hosted a small gathering at his home. Reuben, Claire, Daniels, Rachel, and a few others came together to celebrate how far the town had come. To the future, Reuben said, raising his glass, and to the people who make it worth fighting for. The toast was met with smiles and laughter, a reflection of the camaraderie that had grown among them. As the sun set that night, Marcus stood on his porch with Duke, watching the horizon turn shades of orange and pink. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the challenges, the fears, and the triumphs. "You've been through it all with me, haven't you, boy?" Marcus said, looking down at Duke. The dog wagged his tail, his steady gaze filled with trust and affection. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The road ahead would undoubtedly bring more challenges, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. This story reminds us that courage, loyalty, and community can overcome even the darkest challenges. Marcus and Duke's journey is a testament to the power of standing together and refusing to let hate win. If this story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on how you can make a difference in your own community. Small actions lead to big changes. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire and uplift. And if you love this, check out our next video. It's one you won't want to miss. Thank you for watching, and remember, we're stronger together.